One of the most controversial and challenging questions that emerges from the study of Scripture is whether the Bible justifies or endorses the concept of holy war. This question has troubled theologians, religious leaders, and believers for centuries, especially when confronted with Old Testament narratives describing God commanding the complete destruction of entire nations, while the New Testament presents Jesus teaching love for enemies and turning the other cheek when struck. The tension is undeniable and profound. On one hand, we have detailed accounts of divinely ordered military campaigns, such as the conquest of Canaan, where the Israelites received explicit instructions to take possession of the promised land through military force. On the other hand, we find Jesus explicitly rejecting violence, even when his followers attempted to defend him with swords during his arrest. This apparent contradiction has been used both by critics and defenders of the Christian faith to support opposing arguments. Some argue that the Bible is inherently violent and therefore dangerous. Others claim that the peaceful teachings of the New Testament surpass the military narratives of the Old. To properly understand this complex issue, we must carefully examine the historical, theological, and cultural context of these narratives, as well as the progression of divine revelation through the centuries. Welcome to the portal of the unknown, where we explore the deepest mysteries of the Holy Scriptures and unravel questions that challenge our understanding. If you seek answers to the most difficult questions in the Bible and want to dive into the enigmas that have intrigued humanity for centuries, you are in the right place. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you won't miss any revelation that could transform your understanding of faith. The conquest of the land of Canaan, where the Israelites, under the leadership of Joshua, fought to take possession of the land promised by God to Abraham and his descendants. These battles, though violent, were seen as the fulfillment of divine justice against corrupt nations. This perspective is fundamental to understanding the concept of war in the Old Testament. They were not conflicts initiated by territorial ambition or material greed, but divine judicial actions carried out through human instruments. The historical context reveals that the Canaanite nations practiced extremely brutal rituals, including child sacrifice, ritual prostitution, and other forms of moral corruption that had reached unbearable levels. According to the biblical narrative, these practices were not isolated aberrations, but systematic characteristics of entire civilizations that had completely rejected basic moral principles. The right of the Israelites to take that land and the way in which they were to do so remains, even today, the subject of much questioning, including doubts about the very character of God and the current right over the Holy Land. This contemporary tension reflects the difficulty of reconciling narratives of divinely authorized violence with our modern understanding of human rights and international justice. It is crucial to understand that these military campaigns were not presented as universal models for resolving conflicts, but as unique events in salvation history, serving specific purposes in the establishment of a nation through which worldwide redemption would eventually be offered. If you are enjoying this deep analysis of one of the most controversial themes in the Bible, leave your like now. This helps YouTube's algorithm bring this content to more people who are also seeking honest answers to difficult questions. And don't forget, your opinion matters. Comment below what you think about the wars of the Old Testament. The wars commanded by God in the Old Testament possessed very specific characteristics that set them apart from conventional military conflicts. First, they were always divine initiatives, not human ones. The Israelites did not decide on their own to attack other nations. They received explicit commands from God for specific military actions against specific peoples for specific reasons. Second, these wars had purposes that transcended common military or territorial objectives. They served to establish a holy nation, preserve the religious purity necessary for the fulfillment of God's redemptive plans for the world, and execute divine judgments against societies that had crossed the acceptable moral limits. Third, there were strict regulations on how these wars were to be conducted. They were not licenses for uncontrolled violence, but carefully regulated military operations with specific instructions regarding the treatment of prisoners, the distribution of spoils, and the preservation of certain people and properties. Fourth, these campaigns often included supernatural elements that clearly demonstrated their divine origin. In Joshua 5:13-6-27, it is reported that after the Israelites crossed the Jordan River, they surrounded the city for 7 days, and the walls collapsed by divine power, after which the city was invaded and completely destroyed under Joshua's leadership. Such supernatural manifestations serve to distinguish these actions from merely human wars. The coming of Jesus marks a fundamental transition in divine revelation concerning violence and conflict. The teachings of Jesus in the Gospels emphasize love, forgiveness, and non-violence. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus teaches, "You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other also." And it can be stated with considerable certainty that the Gospels and the New Testament present a fundamentally non-violent Jesus. This transition does not represent a change in the divine character, but the fulfillment of ancient prophecies regarding the nature of the Messianic kingdom. As the prophet-poet Isaiah envisioned, Isaiah 60:18, concerning the times of the Messiah, never again would violence, Hamas, be heard in the land, nor destruction within its borders. The kingdom that Jesus came to establish would operate through principles radically different from those necessary during Israel's national establishment. Jesus not only taught principles of nonviolence, but also consistently modeled them throughout his ministry. When Peter tried to defend him with the sword in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus ordered him to put the weapon away, declaring that all who draw the sword will die by the sword. This was not a situational decision, but the expression of a fundamental principle of his kingdom. Jesus Christ did not encourage his followers to participate in wars. Instead, he said, "Continue to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father who is in heaven." Matthew 5:44-45. This teaching establishes a clear standard for Christian conduct in relation to conflicts. Do you agree that Jesus established a new standard of nonviolence? Or do you believe there is still room for just wars in Christianity? Share your opinion in the comments. And if this video is making you think differently about biblical themes, share it with your friends and family. Let's spread knowledge and healthy debate. Throughout Christian history, different traditions have developed various approaches to reconcile the war narratives of the Old Testament with the peaceful teachings of Jesus. Some theological streams emphasize the progressive nature of divine revelation, arguing that the wars of the Old Testament were necessary to establish the historical conditions that would allow for the coming of the Messiah and the universal proclamation of the gospel of peace. Other traditions focus on typology, interpreting the physical wars of the Old Testament as foreshadowings of the spiritual warfare that characterizes the Christian era. From this perspective, the true enemies that Christians must fight are not people or nations, but spiritual principalities and powers, sin and injustice. A third approach emphasizes the distinction between the role of Israel as a theocratic nation in the Old Testament and the Church as an international spiritual community in the New. It is argued that the responsibilities and methods appropriate for a divinely established nation differ significantly from those appropriate for a religious community operating within multiple political structures. According to some more radical contemporary interpretations, this is seen as bad theology that must be rejected by religious leaders, who should proclaim that violence is foreign to Christianity, and that armament, nuclear or conventional militarism, and war must be abolished and replaced by human and moral methods of resolving conflicts. The question of divine authority versus human initiative. A crucial distinction for this discussion is the difference between military actions directly commanded by God and wars initiated by human motivations. In the Old Testament, authentic holy wars were always the result of explicit divine commands, often accompanied by confirming supernatural signs and conducted under divinely appointed leadership. This distinction is fundamental because it establishes that direct divine authorization was the legitimizing element of these actions, not precedents that could be universally applied by any group claiming religious motivations. The wars commanded by God in the Old Testament do not provide justification for modern conflicts carried out in the name of religion, precisely because they lack the essential element of unequivocal divine authorization. The absence of this element of direct and verifiable divine command means that all wars after the biblical era, regardless of their alleged religious motivations, must be evaluated by the universal ethical standards established in Scripture, including the peaceful teachings of Jesus about loving enemies and resolving conflicts non-violently. The tragic history of the Crusades, the Inquisition, and other allegedly religious conflicts demonstrates the dangers of applying specific Old Testament narratives as precedents for contemporary military action without the clear and unequivocal divine authorization that characterized the original biblical campaigns. Is this content making you reflect? Then don't miss our complete playlist on the mysteries of the Bible here on Portal of the Unknown. We have dozens of videos exploring controversial themes, enigmatic prophecies, and surprising revelations that will expand your understanding of Scripture. Click on the card that's on the screen now. Christ made it clear that the building of peace requires the constant practice of forgiveness, mercy, and the healing of wounds caused by conflicts, divisions, and violence. Peace be with you is more than a wish for peace. The presence of the risen Christ is peace itself, suggesting a radically different approach to resolving human conflicts. The Christian pacifist movement argues that the teachings and example of Jesus establish an unequivocal standard of non-violence for his followers. This perspective views the war narratives of the Old Testament as part of a former dispensation that was surpassed by the superior teachings of the Messiah. Christian pacifists often point to the fact that Jesus had multiple opportunities to endorse or participate in justifiable violence against Roman oppression, against religious corruption, or even in self-defense, but consistently chose alternative methods of responding to conflict. We must remember that peace begins in daily life, in the struggle against domestic violence, religious intolerance, the violation of human rights, and so on. Not to mention the false news that populates social networks and spreads hatred and vengeance among people. This perspective broadens the concept of pacifism beyond issues of international war, applying it to all forms of conflict and violence. The New Testament, while rejecting physical violence as an appropriate method for Christians, introduces the concept of spiritual warfare, a real but non-physical conflict against forces of evil operating in the spiritual realm. Paul writes in Ephesians that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. This reconceptualization of war offers Christians a framework for understanding their role in opposing evil without resorting to physical violence. The weapons of this war are spiritual: prayer, fasting, proclamation of truth, acts of love and justice, and non-violent resistance to oppression and injustice. Spiritual warfare acknowledges that there is a real cosmic conflict between good and evil, but places this conflict in the spiritual realm rather than identifying it with clashes between specific human groups. This perspective allows Christians to maintain a sense of combative mission without directing physical hostility against other human beings, who are seen as potential converts rather than enemies to be destroyed. This approach also provides a coherent interpretation of the Old Testament war narratives, seeing them as temporary, physical representations of eternal spiritual principles that remain relevant when applied in the proper context of spiritual warfare. The question of whether the Bible justifies holy wars requires a nuanced answer that acknowledges both the complexity of the biblical narratives and the progression of divine revelation throughout salvation history. The wars commanded by God in the Old Testament were unique events in history, carried out under direct divine authorization for specific purposes related to the establishment of Israel and the preservation of the messianic lineage. These events do not set precedents for contemporary conflicts conducted in the name of religion, precisely because they lack the essential element of direct and unequivocal divine command. The coming of Jesus marks a fundamental transition in God's methods of dealing with conflict and injustice, establishing love, forgiveness, and non-violence as the distinctive marks of his followers. For contemporary Christians, the proper synthesis acknowledges that while God may have used military methods during specific periods of biblical history, the teachings and example of Jesus clearly establish that his followers must seek the non-violent resolution of conflicts, demonstrate love for enemies, and engage in spiritual warfare against evil through spiritual rather than physical means. This perspective does not diminish the seriousness of Christian opposition to evil or injustice, but redirects it through channels consistent with the character and teachings of Jesus. The result is a faith that can be simultaneously combative against evil and compassionate toward the perpetrators of evil, seeking their conversion and redemption rather than their physical destruction. Thus, while the Bible records historical holy wars conducted under direct divine authorization, it does not justify or endorse contemporary holy wars initiated by human religious motivations. The standard established by Jesus remains the definitive norm for Christian conduct regarding violence and conflict. And you, what is your position on this complex question? Does the Bible justify holy wars, or did Jesus completely change this paradigm? Leave your opinion in the comments and let's continue this important debate. Here on Portal of the Unknown, we don't run from difficult questions. We explore the deepest mysteries of faith with honesty and respect. If this video has expanded your understanding of this controversial theme, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Every week we bring new content on biblical mysteries, prophecies, apocryphal texts, and questions that challenge our faith. Be sure to check out our next video on teachings about divine vengeance and redemption, where we will continue exploring the enigmas that have intrigued humanity for millennia. See you in the next revelation here on Portal of the Unknown.